And I want to talk about a statement that you made. This is a great jumping off point. In the nutritional guidelines, somebody said, saturated fat is not required in the human diet. I want to talk about why that statement is misleading and potentially very, very wrong. So in our body, there is something called de novo lipogenesis, whereby our body makes fat, but our body makes saturated fat. So this, again, just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense from the Ansel Keys perspective. Your body, my body, every single body makes palmitic acid in the body. We make stearic acid. Well, I don't know if we make stearic, but we make a 16 chain or an 18 chain, palmitic acid in the human body. That is de novo lipogenesis. We make this. Why would our bodies make something that is so bad for us? And then our bodies have an enzyme, which is called SCD1, steroyl-CoA desaturase. It's a delta 9 desaturase, and I'll talk about why that enzyme is so important. That turns that saturated fatty acid, that turns that palmitic acid to palmitoleic acid. It turns into a monounsaturated fatty acid. And that ratio between palmitic and palmitoleic acid is very, very important. And this is where PUFAs come into play. The human body does not make polyunsaturated fatty acids, ever. We don't make it. So all of the polyunsaturated fatty acids in our body are from our diet, and this is what's so concerning to me about polyunsaturated vegetable oil, is that essentially we are a gas tank, and all of our body will store the oils that we eat. So if you drink corn oil, or you are taking 2 tablespoons or 4 tablespoons of corn oil every day in your diet, you are storing that corn oil in your cells. And that corn oil, that polyunsaturated PUFA is eventually going to get oxidized in a process called beta oxidation. But remember, that is linoleic acid, which looks very different than stearic or palmitic acid because it is a polyunsaturated fatty acid. Oleic acid and palmitoleic acid are monounsaturated fatty acids. So the way they go through beta oxidation is very importantly different. But this is the point that I made earlier, that evolutionarily, humans have only ever seen very, very low amounts of polyunsaturated fatty acids in our diet because wild animals don't have polyunsaturated fatty acids to the level that domesticated animals do. I want to share this because I think it's super fascinating. The fatty acid content in chicken thigh and breast as affected by dietary polyunsaturation level. Basically, this study says that if you feed a chicken corn, it will have way more polyunsaturated fatty acid in its diet, in its body, than a wild bird. Okay, so basically, chickens fed corn are like a synthetic or a sneaky source of vegetable oil. So people might be listening to this and thinking, I don't drink vegetable oil, but if you're eating mainstream chicken that's fed corn, you are getting linoleic acid in this way. And I'll tell you why this is a big deal in a moment. The other thing I want to highlight here is that we see the same thing in pork. The fatty acid content from pork is the same thing. The effect of dietary mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids on the fatty acid composition of pigs' adipose tissues. The takeaway here is that if you feed a pig corn or you feed a pig soybeans, their fat is going to be very PUFA, polyunsaturated fatty acid enriched. And again, if we are eating animal foods that have higher concentrations of polyunsaturated fatty acids than our human biology is expecting, things go awry very, very badly. And this is why. Because humans don't make polyunsaturated fatty acids. And because of the way that beta oxidation of these polyunsaturated fatty acids happens, it can affect the insulin sensitivity of the adipocyte. You guys better buckle up because this is about to get a little bit crazy, I'm telling you. I did an Instagram of this on Saturday morning. So if you want to rewatch it, you can rewatch that as well. But I want us to talk about this as a really interesting theory. And this is why saturated fatty acids are absolutely invaluable to human health. So check this out. If you guys have seen beta oxidation, this is the process of breaking down long-chain fatty acids into short-chain fatty acids to be used for energy within your mitochondria. The takeaway from this is that as a fatty acid is broken down in beta oxidation, FADH2 and NADH2 are produced. But the very important piece here is that when you break down polyunsaturated fatty acids or monounsaturated fatty acids, they have a different ratio of FADH2 to NADH2. Paul, why are you telling us all this? Because that ratio of FADH2 to to NADH2 determines whether your adipocyte is going to be insulin sensitive or insulin resistant. And this is where things get a little complicated. So bear with me here, you guys. You want your fat cells, so this is the fat cells in your belly. You want your fat cells to be insulin resistant, because when insulin binds to the surface of an adipocyte, that is going to trigger, if that fat cell is insulin sensitive, that fat cell will take up glucose and will take up lipids via lipoprotein lipase, and that fat cell will grow. You want your fat cells to be insulin resistant. And the way you get fat cells that are insulin resistant is by eating saturated fat. And this has been shown time and time again, that if you increase the amount of palmitic acid and stearic acid in the diet, your fat cells become insulin resistant, which means that when insulin spikes with a meal and insulin signals to those adipocytes to grow, they won't respond. Those adipocytes won't take up glucose and they won't take up lipids and become bigger fat cells. What I am saying here, guys, is that suet from animals is a fat burner. Suet from animals is a fire starter. If you eat a diet that is higher in stearic acid and palmitic acid, you will lose weight because it is telling your fat cells to be insulin resistant. You don't want your fat cells to be insulin sensitive. Now, because, and this is where things get a little bit shaky, so bear with me, because of the different structure of the polyunsaturated fatty acids in beta oxidation and that changing ratio of FADH2 to NADH2, your fat cells become insulin sensitive when you eat polyunsaturated fatty acids. It breaks your metabolism. And insulin sensitive fat cells equal fat cells that are growing and getting bigger. And fat cells that are getting bigger means fat people. So if you want to get fat, eat polyunsaturated fatty acids because they have a unique signal to your abdominal adipocytes to make them more insulin sensitive. Now, finish the story here. As the fat cell expands, right, it sends out free fatty acids to the rest of the body. And the signals from that fat cell are called lipokines. I'm going to do a whole podcast about this in the future, you guys. As your fat cells grow, they send out free fatty acids to the rest of the body. And those free fatty acids from the fat cells tell the rest of the body whether it should be insulin sensitive or insulin resistant. And those free fatty acids are what determine what is going on.
So we know from the largest analysis ever done on randomized controlled trials, the Cochrane meta-analysis of 2020, that the effect of saturated fat on cardiovascular disease is shaped like an S. So what this means is that as the level of saturated fat intake rises, initially not much happens to risk, and then suddenly at one point the risk shoots up, and then it just stays high and not much happens again as the level of saturated fat intake rises more. This might sound like a nerdy detail, but trust me, this is absolutely essential, and this explains a lot of the confusion, and it will come into play. If we oversimplify the message and we just say, well, saturated fat is bad, period, in our minds we'll imagine a straight line. The more saturated fat I eat, the higher my risk should be. Well, that's not the reality at all. As we've said in previous videos, saturated fat isn't bad per se. All kinds of health-promoting foods contain some saturated fat. Fish, olive oil, beans, even leafy greens. A lot of people are surprised to hear that, and if you Google it, it might show up as a 0 because they round it down. But the truth is there is some saturated fat in there. If you look up the USDA database, for example, or if you increase the dose a lot, you'll see it pop up. So saturated fat isn't bad. We don't want 0 saturated fat in our diet. Healthy dietary patterns contain some saturated fat. It's when it's too high that we run into problems. It's just like anything else. Cholesterol levels, potassium levels, glucose levels, right? All these things are normal. We want them in our body. We just want them in the healthy range. So saturated fat is an important factor, but it's not the only one. And in fact, focusing more on the whole food and even the whole dietary pattern is generally a very good idea. And that's a good take-home message, and we'll circle back to this in the end. People also ask about the effect of saturated fat on the risk of death, the risk of mortality. And there's some variability. Some analyses show an effect, some don't pick up a statistically significant effect. We'll look at some examples in a minute. But I think it's okay to make a conservative statement that we have less confidence on the effect of saturated fat on the risk of mortality than on the risk of cardiovascular disease outcomes in general. I think that's objective to say. So that's a super brief overview of the field. Obviously, there's areas of uncertainty. There always are in any field. With the randomized controlled trials, for example, they tend to be smallish. There's questions about trans fats in there. We'll touch on that in a minute. And the more granular we get, the less certain we are. In general, in the randomized controlled trials, we see a benefit of moderating saturated fat, but the specific replacement is less clear. PUFAs generally look best. MUFAs, the monounsaturated fatty acids, and carbohydrates, less clear. But there's also less trials using those replacements. And when we get into subtypes of PUFAs, omega-3s versus omega-6s, it's even less clear. There's going to be obviously less trials for each, so it tends to be not statistically significant. Okay, so now we're ready to look at the new narrative review, the boogeyman review. All right, so the rationale is they're going to do a comprehensive review, that's what they call it, looking at all the publications on saturated fat and cardiovascular disease coming out between 2010 and 2021. So that's their period of interest. Anything being published in that range, they're interested in. And they're looking specifically at what's called heart outcomes. So actual cardiovascular events, heart attacks, strokes, or death, not just changes of cholesterol levels in the blood. So that sounds good. Interesting endeavor. So they start going through these studies that they picked up. So the first section is the epidemiological studies. And the first study they look at is PURE. Now, PURE was a large epidemiological study looking at a number of different countries. So they summarized the findings of PURE. They write, all fats, and that included saturated fat, were not associated with cardiovascular disease, myocardial infarction, heart attacks, or mortality. That's not surprising. We already know looking at changes in saturated fat intake without specifying a replacement tends to be kind of a wash. Depending on replacement, we might see lower risk, the same, or even higher. Now, they don't mention it in the review, but PURE did have another analysis later on where they looked at the effect of replacement of saturated fat with total carbohydrate, which is better, but we now also understand the problem with that, right? If we just look at total carbs and we don't specify, we don't discriminate if we're talking about whole carbs, high quality carbs, or low quality carbs, refined carbs, in general, in most populations, it's going to be refined carbs. And we're not going to see much of an effect on risk compared to saturated fat. There are other problems with PURE that have been addressed many times. The socioeconomic disparity between affluent countries and poorer countries that they included in the analysis. So specifically with saturated fat, the highest intake was seen in North America and Europe, and the lowest intake in Africa and China, mostly rural populations. So this introduces an obvious potential problem that differences in healthcare and just quality of life in general might affect the results. Now in PURE, they did try to adjust for that statistically in the supplementary data for some of the socioeconomic factors, but to what extent can we correct for that level of disparity comparing Sweden and Canada to Africa and rural China? I don't know. If we compare it to the Harvard analysis, for example, where all of the participants were healthcare professionals, all in the US, it's a much more uniform population, a lot less socioeconomic confounders. So we just have to bear these things in mind and just do the best we can. So that's PURE. Very difficult to conclude anything about saturated fat from PURE. Next, they look at the UK Biobank. This is another large epidemiological cohort. And they summarize their findings. They found no evidence that saturated fat intake was associated with cardiovascular disease, which is true, and we already understand this now. Without looking at specific replacements, we don't expect much of an effect. But the UK Biobank also showed that saturated fat intake associated with higher risk of total death. It's right in figure 1 of the study. It goes straight up. They don't mention that in the new narrative review. I guess they missed it. You don't even need to read the paper. It's in the abstract. In fact, it's the only mention of saturated fat in the abstract of the UK Biobank paper. They say lower intake of saturated fat was associated with a lower risk of mortality. I always assume best intentions, so I'm going with they didn't notice this. Okay, the next sentence in the Boogeyman review, let's call it the narrative review, more professional. Their next sentence talks about substitutions. So now we're in business. This is what we want to look at. They say substitution of polyunsaturated fats for saturated fat was associated with a higher cardiovascular disease risk. So reducing saturated fat and increasing polyunsaturated fat was associated with a higher risk. That goes against everything we know. We definitely want to look into that. So here's the study, and this is the part that talks about replacements. So let's look at what they say. Replacing saturated fat with monounsaturated fat or protein was associated with lower risk of death and cardiovascular disease. Replacing saturated fat with starch was not significantly associated with cardiovascular disease, but was associated with lower mortality. Replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, with PUFAs, this is what they mentioned, was not significantly associated with mortality, but was associated with a higher risk of CVD, cardiovascular disease. So this part right here is what they're talking about. And replacing saturated fat with sugar, so refined carbs, was associated with lower total death, but higher cardiovascular disease. So saturated fat looked worse than monounsaturated fats, it looked worse than protein, it looked worse than starch. Even with refined sugar, the replacement didn't look great for saturated fat overall. Lower mortality when we swapped for more refined sugar and less saturated fat. This is the sentence they cited. The rest of the replacements, the rest of the paragraph, they just missed. I'm still going with they didn't notice it, all right? Assuming best intentions. Okay, but we have a mystery. Why do PUFAs look worse than this replacement? That's surprising. That goes against everything we know. So we don't want to dismiss this finding. We also don't want to reflexively accept this and dismiss the rest of the field. So we want to understand why we have an outlier. What's going on here? The obvious first thing to look at is source. PUFAs, polyunsaturated fats, can come in fatty fish, nuts and seeds, liquid vegetable oil. Those are generally the recommended sources. Or it can come in ultra-processed foods and junk foods that just happen to contain PUFA oils, polyunsaturated fat oils. So I dug around the data for the UK Biobank population, and this is what they report. 18% of the PUFAs were coming from recommended sources like fatty fish and nuts or seeds. The number one source of PUFAs was grains, especially refined grains. So baked goods and pastries, that type of thing. Okay, so that makes sense. Now, we want to apply the same level of scrutiny across, right? We also want to look at whether the saturated fat was coming from a quality source. And a chunk of the saturated fat in the UK Biobank population was also coming from those same refined grains. So baked goods and whatnot, right? 24% of the saturated fat was coming from those foods. So I would also be cautious about the saturated fat data in UK Biobank. In fact, that might explain why saturated fat looked so bad in the replacements, losing to almost everything. In contrast, if we look at the Harvard analysis, the main sources of PUFA were liquid vegetable oils, nuts, and some animal products like chicken, for example. So that's much closer to what's recommended as healthy sources. And the saturated fat in that population was coming mostly from meats and dairy. We're not saying that the Harvard's analysis is perfect. Nothing's ever perfect. But as we try to make sense of things, as we try to decide how much weight each study has, so we can look at balance of evidence, these are all things that we have to bear in mind. Now, I know there's 1,000 other questions about the source. What if the saturated fat is coming from grass-fed products? What if it's organic? We actually went over the evidence on grass-fed not too long ago, a few months ago. I'll link that at the end of the video. And we have more material coming very soon on a lot of the frequently asked questions on saturated fat. All right? So we have to look at how things are done, not just go by sound bites or bullet points, right? People can do that on social media. People do that on Twitter all day long. In a peer-reviewed publication in a medical journal, we have to expect more. We got to do better. They have to dig deeper. Okay, next. We're almost done with this section of the narrative review, the section looking at epidemiological studies. In the last part, they look at two Dutch studies, very similar, by the same authors. And here we're going to see an example of the principle of dose that we talked about, right? It comes into play here. So in the first Dutch study, they say saturated fat was associated with lower ischemic heart disease. Wow, what's going on here? We expect not much change in a general population without specifying a replacement. We see a lower risk with saturated fat intake. We definitely want to look at that. So here's the study. And when we look at how much saturated fat they were eating, they were taking in a lot. They stated very clearly, more than 97% of the population exceeded the upper limit of 10% recommended by the Health Council of the Netherlands. So the recommendations in the Netherlands are actually the same, keep it under 10%, same cutoff as in the US. I actually didn't know that. There you go. So this population of Dutch people were almost every single one of them above the dynamic range. In fact, the lowest group, the group eating the least saturated fat, averaged 12% of their calories from saturated fat, and the highest one was getting 18. So they're all in this flat part of the S-curve to the right. So I wouldn't expect much difference in risk at that range. The effect of saturated fat is maxed out for all of them. So any differences we see in this population, I would expect them to come from the other foods people are eating. So if the saturated fat replaces an unhealthy food, yeah, I might expect a bit of a benefit, because more saturated fat in that range is probably not going to make a big difference. And if we're raising it at the expense of an unhealthy food, then the net effect might be a benefit. And that's what they found. They saw a benefit when saturated fat replaced carbohydrate, but only low quality, not high quality carbs. They also saw a benefit when saturated fat replaced protein, but only animal protein, not vegetable protein. And finally, they saw a benefit when saturated fat replaced unsaturated fats, which the authors suggest may be due to industrial trans fats that were still present in some of the unsaturated fat food sources like margarines. And if you remember, we said earlier, trans fats are more harmful than saturated fat. So basically the findings of this Dutch study are that for a population that's eating a substantial amount of saturated fat, high range, past that dynamic phase, eating even more might not make much of a difference, and it might even help if you're reducing something else that's unhealthy, like refined grains or trans fats. Now, just a little aside, that it's absolutely crucial that we always make this distinction between quality carbs, whole grains, and low quality carbs, refined carbs, junk food, because there is rampant confusion among the public and even some health professionals, even some doctors, on this issue. So the last thing we want is to propagate this confusion by talking about carbohydrates in general and not making the distinction between oatmeal and beans and fruit, which are health promoting, and frozen pizza and cookies and crackers and Twinkies, which not so much. The last epidemiological study they look at is another study in the Dutch population, identical, same authors, same range of intake, same issues, so we don't have to repeat the whole thing. So that wraps up the epidemiological section of the narrative review. Now, notice they didn't talk about the Harvard analysis, and it was exactly on this topic they're interested in. And remember, the period of interest for them that they specified was 2010 to 2021. Harvard analysis came out in 2015, smack in the middle. They don't cite it, they don't talk about it. It's like it doesn't exist. It was a reference publication in this field. They haven't heard of it. All right, next, they go into the clinical trials. The first one they mention is Predimed, which is really bizarre because Predimed changed the entire dietary pattern, and there was barely any change to saturated fat intake. So Predimed is not a test of the effect of saturated fat on anything. Next, they look at a trial of blood markers, lipid levels, which they specifically said was an exclusion criterion for their narrative review. I guess they missed this, okay. And this trial didn't measure total saturated fat intake during the intervention. It was a 4-week trial looking at blood levels of lipids. So it's not what they were looking for at all. And they even say that that trial concluded there's no evidence to modify existing recommendations to reduce saturated fat. I have no idea why they included this. It's just bizarre. Okay, the last randomized control trial in this section is a trial out of India that gave people different oils. Could be an interesting experiment, but they don't report how much total saturated fat people ate. Was it already super high at baseline? Was it low? Did it increase significantly on either of the groups? This trial doesn't answer that. I'm not knocking the narrative review for including this Indian trial. I think it's probably appropriate to include it. It's just inconclusive either way. Okay, so now we're getting into the last section of the narrative review, which is where they look at meta-analyses and systematic reviews. So this is where the rubber meets the road. And they go over the usual meta-analyses, Siri Torino, Chowdhury, you've heard about those now, We already know those don't discriminate. Replacements, they don't even discriminate dose either. So we understand that now. And finally, we get to the point. The analyses that do discriminate between replacements. So they say in the narrative review, several meta-analyses demonstrated that reducing saturated fat and replacing it with PUFAs, with polyunsaturated fats, is more beneficial to preventing cardiovascular disease. A shift toward greater PUFA consumption in place of saturated fat would significantly reduce rates of coronary heart disease. This is one of the meta-analyses they're referring to. It says linoleic acid, that's a type of PUFA, replacing saturated fat was associated with lower coronary heart disease and lower coronary heart disease death. Conclusion, these data provide support for current recommendations to replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat for prevention of coronary heart disease. This is another one they cite, meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. It looked specifically at increasing polyunsaturated fat in place of saturated fat. And they found consuming polyunsaturated fat in place of saturated fat reduces coronary heart disease events in randomized controlled trials. This suggests that rather than lowering PUFA consumption, maybe as the internet tells us to do, a shift toward greater population PUFA consumption in place of saturated fat would significantly reduce rates of coronary heart disease. So these are some of the meta-analyses the narrative review cites and quotes. In the next paragraph, they bring up the Cochrane meta-analysis, which we touched on earlier in the video. A Cochrane review of randomized controlled trials suggested that replacing saturated fat with PUFA, polyunsaturated fat, appears to be a useful strategy, meaning that it reduced cardiovascular events. Carbohydrates and MUFAs, monounsaturated, was not statistically significant. We covered that in the beginning of the video. There's less trials looking at those replacements. So we don't know with as much certainty if those work or not. Another study reported that replacing saturated fat with PUFAs was associated with significant coronary heart disease reduction, which was confirmed by randomized controlled trials. Here's that study that they're talking about. In general, saturated fat was not associated with coronary heart disease or stroke. Apparently, great word. But studies did not take replacement into account. Bingo. When replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fatty acids, then it was associated with coronary heart disease reduction. Back to the narrative review. They continue. Another study found that PUFA-rich vegetable oil in place of saturated animal fats reduces coronary heart disease events. You get the idea. This goes on and on. If we lump everything together, we tend to not see much. If we look at specific replacements, especially PUFAs, we see a benefit of moderating saturated fat under that 10% threshold, give or take, right? So this is old news to you now. Next, they bring up the Sydney Heart Trial in Minnesota. Now, we've talked about these trials in previous videos. They basically ask people to bring down the saturated fat and replace it with an unsaturated oil and a margarine. The problem is, back then, these trials were conducted in the 60s and 70s. The margarines had a very high content of trans fats. It's not their fault, it's not bad design. Just back then, this wasn't understood. But we now know this swap probably makes things worse. And on top of that, Minnesota was interrupted because the policies nationwide changed and they lost their subjects. So Minnesota, they pulled the plug on that trial about a third of the way in. But Sydney was concluded, and it's actually included in the latest Cochrane meta-analysis. So we don't need to speculate about the trans fat issues. And the net result of the Cochrane was still a benefit of moderating saturated fat under 10% of calories, even with Sydney in there. So even including trials with massive methodological issues, the big picture is still essentially the same. And finally, they bring up another meta-analysis that looked specifically at replacement with omega-6s, so a specific subtype of PUFA, and did not find a statistically significant difference. Yep, this is not in contradiction with the Cochrane, for example. We don't have that level of granularity with most RCTs. I think it's okay to say we have less certainty on this level of the subtypes of PUFA. And the rest of it is mainly repetition of things we already looked at. And then the last thing they did was summarize how many of the studies that they found saw an effect of saturated fat. But again, They made some basic errors. For example, the 2020 Cochrane meta, which is the largest meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, and they found a benefit of reducing saturated fat. They put it down as no impact. So basically as a negative result. It's just hard to understand this. It's just a lack of familiarity with the field in general, a lack of rigor. But the worst part is that in this analysis that they did in the end, they just counted how many studies found a significant effect and how many didn't. That was it. They didn't account for study quality. They didn't look at how things were done. This is not serious. That's not how you analyze a field. If you want to put a number on it, you can do a meta-analysis. You get an average of the summary of all the trials put together. You get a confidence interval, and there's ways to do it. There's procedures to do that. You don't just go down the list counting effect, no effect, no effect, without understanding what you're looking at. Here's another example of so many. They cite this analysis, and they say saturated fat was not associated with coronary heart disease or cardiovascular disease or mortality, which is true when replacement is not specified. But if you read it, it says the largest prospective study suggested replacing saturated fat with high glycemic index carbohydrates, so that's a marker of low quality carbs, refined carbs, increased risk of cardiovascular disease. But replacement with low glycemic index carbohydrate, like whole fruit, vegetables, pulses, grains, they're referring to whole grains, decreased risk. And more importantly, replacement of saturated fat by polyunsaturated fat conferred the greatest reduction in risk of cardiovascular disease. In other words, the swaps that no one recommends with low quality carbohydrates are not beneficial. And the swaps recommended by every professional health organization in the world lower risk. They put this analysis down as inconclusive, but it basically reflects the bulk of the evidence in this field. And again, as they go through and put together this list, they miss a ton of big studies that completely fit their criteria. And again, remember, this is supposed to be a comprehensive review by their own definition. So this large analysis, for example, found convincing evidence that partial replacement of saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat decreases risk of cardiovascular disease in men. They're not familiar with this one, not cited. Here's another. Replacing saturated fat with unsaturated fat lowers coronary heart disease. Replacing with linoleic acid, a type of PUFA, lowers coronary heart disease death. Replacing saturated fat with high quality carbohydrates, so whole carbs, lowers coronary heart disease events. They're not familiar with this one either. Not cited, not mentioned. And these are all in the timeline they specified. Here's another one. It's a meta-analysis of 1 million people. Saturated fat was associated with higher risk of death. Inverse association for total fat, MUFAs and PUFAs. So lower risk of death associated with unsaturated fats and total fat. They're not familiar with this one either, not cited. Another one, different meta-analysis, also looking at 1 million people total. Diets high in saturated fat were associated with higher mortality from all causes, so total death, from cardiovascular disease and from cancer. Whereas diets high in polyunsaturated fat were associated with lower mortality from all causes, cardiovascular disease and cancer. They're not familiar with this one either, not cited. You get the point. This isn't even an exhaustive list that I just showed you. These are just some big ones that I know of. And I'm not even a lipidologist. Imagine what a specialist in this field who has spent decades working on this can point out. They talk about 4-week trials of blood markers. They talk about trials that didn't measure saturated fat intake. They talk about Predimed, which is not a test of the effect of saturated fat on anything, but analysis with 1 million people that address exactly what they set out to test in their time of interest, their timeline of interest, they've never seen. So their conclusion of their whole overview of their literature is that saturated fat is not conclusively associated with cardiovascular disease or mortality. And there is no scientific ground to demonize saturated fat. And it can be safely included in the diet to reduce cardiovascular disease and mortality. So you see the blueprint. If you're not familiar with the field, if you don't know what's been done, you set out to look at all the studies in a time period, but you miss half of them. You miss the largest ones. The ones you don't miss, you're not quite sure how to interpret them. You don't understand the moving pieces. You don't know what you're looking at. Yeah, we end up really confused. This is how they describe their piece. A comprehensive review to critically evaluate the evidence and demystify allegations and misconceptions about saturated fat, to overcome consumers' confusion and guide them in making heart-healthy choices. This is like comedy writing. Judd Apatow needs to hire this crew. They are going to demystify things for the public. They're not familiar with the field. They're not familiar with the basic principles to interpret the work, but they're going to tell the public what the field means and why the scientists who built the field and who conducted the work that they then misinterpret, why those scientists are all wrong. It's really good to question things. It's really good to challenge authority. It's really good to ask, okay, this thing that everybody says, maybe it's wrong. There's something deeply scientific about that. But in order to agree or disagree with something, first we need to understand it to then form an opinion. In the age of social media, it's the other way around. First, I form a strong emotional opinion based on some sound bites or my personal preference. Then I find a group of people who agree with me and we defend our belief with our lives. And we never go through the learning phase. Just skip that. Disagreeing with something reflexively just because it's coming from an authority without understanding it is just as bad as agreeing reflexively with an authority. It's still being a sheep, as people like to say on social media. Yeah, I have a different shepherd, but I'm still in sheep mode. Now, let me show you something real quick. This narrative review was written by a professor of management at a business school in Dubai with expertise in HR, business, and management. Now, let me make this very clear. In science, we don't dismiss arguments based on credentials, and we don't accept them based on credentials either. I know people with a high school degree who are very knowledgeable in nutrition, and some with very fancy degrees who are incredibly confused about the basics. So we would never rate the article or dismiss the article based on who wrote it. I'm only showing you this after we thoroughly evaluated the work on its merit, because viewers ask me every day, why is nutrition so confusing? Why can't experts agree on anything? Well, we're looking at the anatomy of confusion. An article written with zero understanding of this field, framed as a critique of the entire field, and shared by thousands on social media. Now, to me personally, something like this is kind of entertaining. You know, you read something like this, you have a laugh, and you go back to work. The problem is this creates massive confusion with the public, 99% of which doesn't have the time to go look into all this. I'm not suggesting that they have nefarious purposes, not at all. I sincerely believe that they have the best intentions. But this is the problem we have nowadays, is society-wide with the way information is communicated. Things are done without understanding, without knowledge, and then just... Okay, before we wrap up, a couple of common questions people ask on saturated fat. First, our ancestors hunted and ate animals and ate saturated fat, so shouldn't evolution have taken care of this and made saturated fat harmless? It's an interesting idea, it's an interesting hypothesis, and what we do with hypotheses is we test them. We just went through dozens of tests. And the conclusion is not that saturated fat is bad, it's that an excess of saturated fat raises cardiovascular disease risk. So the hypothesis needs to adapt. Maybe our ancestors didn't eat that much saturated fat. Some authors propose that. Maybe there wasn't that much evolutionary pressure to protect us from it. Because if you're at higher risk of having a heart attack at 60 in the Paleolithic, that's not a big deal evolutionarily. Most people didn't make it that far. The bottleneck is getting to adulthood and reproducing. We want some saturated fat in our diet, but we want it in the healthy range. And on that topic, we're going to finish with a positive note. For all of the misunderstandings and all of the oversights of the narrative review, they close with a point that I completely 100% agree with. That for the public in general, focusing on saturated fat is a distraction and is confusing. Scientists need to know all these details, but for 99% of people trying to decide what's for dinner, focusing less on isolated nutrients and focusing more on what the overall dietary pattern looks like is the way to go. It does all the work for you with a lot less confusion. And because a picture is worth 1,000 words, just keep in mind the Canadian guidelines. This does all of the work for you of saturated fat and everything else. Sometimes people ask, is it the saturated fat itself, or is it the carbs that people tend to consume with them? So if I'm on a low carb diet, maybe that eliminates the risk. There's all these different ideas. What's your experience with that?
There's good evidence that high saturated fat confers higher ApoB. I know people, I don't know how that's so difficult. There have been like hundreds of studies over 50 or 60 years showing that. There's mechanisms that people that you understand through, upregulation of transcription factors that respond to different length fatty acid. I mean, it's a sort of no-brainer. So the question that I get asked from time to time that I think it's, so first of all, on a personal level, I would not say I eat no saturated fat. I do eat some saturated fat, but I eat a reasonable amount. And when I do, I try to eat, sort of maximize the amount from plant sources versus those from animal sources. Do I never eat animal-based saturated fats? Of course, I eat them all the time. Not all the time, but I eat plenty. But for me, it all comes back to ApoB. So if you are one of the lucky people who can eat a hamburger, a ground chuck, whatever, every day of your life, and your ApoB is still good, optimal, I still wouldn't recommend it, but I certainly wouldn't have a strong objection if you said you wanted to keep eating that hamburger every day. I think there probably are some other reasons why it's not optimal. But again, I'm not an epidemiologist, and I think the data are very murky. And that's not why they're coming to see me. They're coming to see me for coronary risk. And from a coronary risk perspective, it's hard for me to go beyond the ApoB. In other words, it's hard for me to make an argument that with a given ApoB, let's say your ApoB is 60 and you're eating a hamburger every day, it's hard for me to argue that that's a problem.
Yeah.
Even though I don't do it. So for me, it's all individual driven. It's all driven by ApoB. Where things get interesting is if somebody says, all right, well, I'm on a statin now, my ApoB is 60. Is it okay? Yeah, those are the harder ones. But I think I sort of feel like we do ourselves a disservice if we lose consistency over the value of this marker that we all hang our hats on as being really important. So I think, again, I'm not talking to people about colon cancer risk. I'm not talking about the environment. I'm not talking about animal rights. I'm talking about ASCVD risk.